All right, so now we are continuing to talk about Catherine. So she comes to the Russian court in 1744. She's married to Grand Duke Peter in 1745, and they have years of an unhappy marriage where reportedly the marriage goes unconsummated for a long time to the extent that Catherine is secretly encouraged to take a lover. She does, Sergei Saltykov and then Stanislav Poniatowski. She bears children during this period of time. And then she has a lover who is a officer in the guards, Grigory Orlov. And so in the summer of 1761, things are looking very bad in Catherine's marriage, or rather, um, early in 1762, uh, right at the end of 1761, Empress Elizaveta passes away, and now the Grand Duke Peter becomes Tsar Peter III. He is now empowered as emperor. And things are looking even worse for Catherine's situation at some level. There is a famous incident where, shortly before court dispersed for the summer of 1762, at a semi public dinner, a court dinner where many nobles and important people are present, Peter humiliated Catherine in public. Catherine understood her situation to be precarious and that perhaps Peter, was on the verge of being done with her, and he might choose to send her to a monastery or something else. Catherine had, in some bad moments, asked permission to return to her homeland from Elizaveta, perhaps strategically, with some strategy in her intentions. Elizaveta had declined in any case. And so it seems like that wasn't really an option. What do you do if you're this imported princess and in a horrible marriage? Your husband is the emperor and has taken a lover. And that relationship seems to have been um, quite sincere to those to Peter and Vorontsova. So it's thought that after this incident, Catherine was more open to the possibility of a coup d'etat and overthrowing her husband, feeling like her situation was it's him or me. That like this situation is not going to continue in just a happy or even unhappy but stable manner. Something's got to give, and this might have made Catherine more open to the possibility of a coup. And so, as the court disperses to their private estates for the summer, Catherine and Peter actually went to different places. He went to spend much of the summer in Oranienbaum. Here is a map. Here's so the Gulf of Finland. Here's the city of St. Petersburg, and up along the coast. And this is let's see, bit of over an hour or so of a drive, or you can take public transport you to get to the state of Oranienbaum, and it's not too far along the coast from the state of Peterhof. So they're living in separate residences at the summer, and the plan is basically formulated that we will overthrow him. And so what happens? Well, oh, in the wee morning hours of June 28th, Catherine is collected to say from Peterhof and to say, come and stand before these soldiers, the Izmailovsky regiment, and let them salute you as their empress. That all these other people, the Orloffs, are these brothers, the Orloffs, Grigory is her lover, and other individuals that are just fed up and disgusted with Peter's rule, have come together, and they have paid money or gifts of money and vodka to the soldiers in a few regiments to declare their loyalty to Catherine. Remember, Peter had pulled out of the 7 Years' War in which Russia was fighting Prussia and made an abrupt pe and contrary peace, contrary to the direction that they had been fighting in. Much treasure had been spent, many lives have been lost. And then to add insult to injury, he was such an admirer of Prussia that he changed the uniforms to something much closer to the Prussian uniform. This was this did much to alienate many in the army, from the highest and to the lowly ranks. So, um, so early in the morning, June 28th, 1762, Catherine is roused and she goes before the Izmailovsky regiment, and they declare their loyalty to her. And then she goes to the Simeon. She starts marching to St. Petersburg. So here, she's there. She starts this march to St. Petersburg, and the Preobrazhensky Guard joins her somewhere on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. They were a little late to the rendezvous point. Evidently, they had taken a little bit extra time tying up officers that were unwilling to go along with this coup. So while there is much disaffection towards Peter, there are officers that saw things quite differently, rejected the notion of participating in a coup, and so they got tied up. And then the Preobrazhensky Guard came, and there was something of a triumphant march down St. Petersburg where uh, rumors are spreading. And the day before, we're told Orlov had gone to a nobleman, Razumovsky, who was the acting head of the Academy of Sciences. The Academy of Sciences is in charge of the printing press, and said, "You'll print up a manifesto declaring that Catherine is now the Empress of Russia." So these things are happening. And Catherine marches up Nevsky Palace. She arrives to the Winter Palace, and here's a view of it on the Neva River. And she appears. This is a painting. I don't know that this audience on the balcony exactly happened like this, but here's a representation of the day of June 28th, 1762. Catherine does arrive to the palace, and she is greeted triumphantly by many people in court and um, soldiers, regiments. She makes another decree to the Senate saying that that Peter is ousted. And then there's this turnaround where she goes and she marches with soldiers towards Oranienbaum. And here is a painting made. This was painted in 1778, so 14 years after it had taken place. But this shows a kind of a martial Catherine. She is on a military horse. She is in uniform, and she is in the green uniform of the Preobrazhensky Guard that Peter had sidelined. And she brings back that uniform. And actually, it said even this procession that's going down Nevsky Prospect, there's carts of these old uniforms, and soldiers are invited to take off the Prussian-inspired uniforms and put back on their old uniforms, and they do. And then they march off to encounter Peter at Oranienbaum. And I'll show you. Here's another map that sort of shows us where the action is. So here is Peterhof, this estate on the coast of the Gulf of Finland. And so she goes into St. Petersburg, and then she is coming back out again, and she stops at at Peterhof. And what has Peter done during this time? So King Frederick of Prussia, he wrote that the conspiracy was mad and badly plotted. Peter III's lack of courage caused him to lose. He let himself be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. If it ends up that way, it doesn't entirely start up that way. So Peter was here at Oranienbaum. Here's that other map that I showed you, Oranienbaum. It hence got renamed in the early 20th century to Lomonosov. And that's why see here, not Oranienbaum, but Lomonosov, and which is in Mikhail Lomonosov was one of the leading lights and first major scientists in the Russian Academy of Sciences in the 18th century, and was also one of the founders of the Lomonosov China factory. This here is some Lomonosov China that is famous, kind of famous Russian China made right there. And there's the monogram of the factory made in Russia. So now it's known as Lomonosov. Then it was Oranienbaum, and that's where Peter was. And so when he gets word, he gets ready to go to Peterhof. Catherine is no longer there because she has been collected to come appear before soldiers. And he also calls for 3,000 troops stationed at Kronstadt, this island in the Gulf of Finland, as well as soldiers from other places to come to his aid at Peterhof. Well, the Kronstadt soldiers refused. The Orloffs have made an arrangement with them to put their loyalty over to Catherine, as do other regiments. When he understands this, he gets in a boat and he has intentions of leaving. Well, the Orloffs had also gotten the word out at key choke points to not let Peter escape. And the way from Kronstadt was blocked when he went to proceed. He gave an order to the attending person there to let him through, to which the reply was shouted, "There is no more Peter the Third." And just beyond the opening to the bay, a man of war was stationed to make sure that Peter did not escape. And at that point, he went back to Oranienbaum. And here we might say that his behavior does, therefore, from this point, well, in fits and starts, his behavior does fit more Frederick II's characterization that he, ceded his power like a child being sent to bed. He wrote Catherine a note that was couriered to her saying, "Forgive me for my wrongs, we can work this out." And Catherine responded by saying, "You can abdicate in writing." And he did. And he asked, then he sent another, there's a flurry of correspondence. And so this is in the day of June 29th. And he writes a letter saying, please just let me stay with my lover, Vorontsova. Please give us a good maintenance so we can live in the style to which we're accustomed. He also requests at one point to be allowed to be sent away. And so this is a, so this is sort of what's happening. Then Peter and Catherine, who has marched out, has received these letters at Peterhof. So she doesn't end up going all the way to Oranienbaum. And Peter is then moved from Oranienbaum to a different castle, Rapsha, which still stood in the early 20th century. And here's a picture of it. And it's at this castle where he will die. He is there on July 2nd. He is there, and Catherine, back in St. Petersburg, gets a note that says, and I'm quoting here from the note, "He is taken badly ill. He was seized for no reason at all by some colic, and I fear lest he might die this very night, and I fear more lest he might get over it." So that's a sort of ambiguous message. Like, we fear he's sick, he might die, or he might survive, and that might be bad. Historians have pondered over this note, and there's wide agreement that had Catherine kind of responded, well, maybe not wide agreement, but had Catherine responded something along the lines, "Absolutely take care of him, I will come to have an audience," and given real clear instructions, perhaps the outcome would have been different. In any case, Catherine doesn't respond at all. And 4 days later, she receives a notice that he's passed away. And it seems like there's also some ambiguity here that on the one hand, he's so sick, he's near death. July 3rd and 4th, apparently he'd been seen and was maybe doing better. But now he was, deathly ill and got so drunk and got involved in a ruckus where there was a fight, and he seems to have been murdered in that fight. And And actually, Orloff, I'll even read to you from Anisimov in Five Empresses. Anisimov recounts, or this is how he explains the death. So on July 6th, or yeah, late on July 6th, in the wake of his death, he writes this note. He says, Dear Mother, merciful Empress, how can I explain, how describe what has happened? You will not believe your devoted servant, but before God I am telling you the truth. Dear Mother, I am ready to meet my death, but I myself do not know how this misfortune came about. We are lost if you do not forgive us. Dear Mother, he is gone, but it was none of our desire, for how should we have dared to raise our hand against our sovereign? But, Majesty, this misfortune has occurred. We were drunk, and so was he. He started to quarrel with Prince Fyodor, referring to Beretinsky. Um, he started to quarrel with Prince Fyodor during dinner. No sooner had we hurried to part them than he was no more. We cannot even remember what he did, but all of us, down to the last man, are wholly guilty and deserve to die for it. Have mercy on me, if only for love of my brother. And that is her favorite, her lover, Grigori. I have confessed my sin, and there is nothing more to seek. As in, please don't investigate this matter further. Forgive, or have me put to death the soonest. My life is a burden to me. We have offended you, and we are damned for all eternity. And that is the letter that informed Catherine that Peter was no more. And so, um, what an unfortunate accident. He shouldn't have riled up. But many people have, it hasn't been lost on them that a letter like this certainly gives Catherine some degree of plausible deniability that, oh, she had nothing to do with it. She didn't even know. Which made things easier going forward. You know, Peter was put in Ropshaw while they were evidently going to make room for him to be permanently imprisoned at the castle in Schlüsselburg on Lake Ladoga. And here, here's another kind of, this is a contemporary tourist map of the St. Petersburg area. And so here's here's St. Petersburg. Right around here, now you can't really see it here, but it's no longer Oranienbaum. It's Lomonosov, like I told you, the name was changed. And then Peterhof is somewhere around here. Here's the island of Kronstadt. And then, oh, in some ways, it's kind of like a bit of an isthmus. Well, not an isthmus because Lake Ladoga is a lake that borders with Finland, and it's on Lake Ladoga that you had the island and the castle of Schlüsselburg, where the deposed Tsar Ivan VI, remember the coup d'état that brought Elizaveta Petrovna to power in 1741? Well, that Ivan VI has been being housed there without kind of knowledge of his genealogy all these past 21 years. And and so they were going to move him out to another location, Kelchom, and put in Peter III. But it wasn't ready, so he's taken to Ropshaw in the meantime, but he doesn't make it out of there because he's murdered. And thus, Catherine is on her way and is now the Empress of Russia. Her coronation took place in Moscow on September 12th, or a new date, September 22nd. Just like when I say the coup took place June 28th, 1762, that's old style dates. September 12th, 1762 as the date of her coronation. That's old style date as well. And in that coronation, it took place in Moscow. She drove to and from the coronation in the church in this carriage, she wore this imperial crown. This right here is a replica of it, a replica of it. And Catherine was the first to wear this imperial crown for a coronation, and Nicholas II was the last czar to be coronated in that crown. So, oh my goodness. I've just realized I'm not sharing with you the screen, so you're not seeing what I am showing you. Oy vey. given time constraints. But let me show you really quickly the pictures that I showed you. Okay. Yeah. So where did we start out? So we're talking about from German princess. Now you're looking at the screen, and we're talking about the coup d'etat. And so here is a little map of the area. Here is a picture of Oranienbaum. Here it is on the map. This is St. Petersburg. In this red circle, Peterhof, the castle where Catherine went to. This is a kind of another contemporary view, and this is Lake Ladoga. So I was kind of showing you that where the island of Schlüsselburg is ended up. This is the Käsner's or a watercolor reproduction by an unknown artist of Käsner's painting of Catherine addressing an audience on the day of June 28th, 1762. And here was just that other. I had this other version of a map that kind of showed you Kronstadt. And here now Lomonosov, but then Oranienbaum and Peterhof here. So kind of here's things in relation to each other. Here's a picture of Rapsha. And here's a portrait of Princess Yekaterina Vorontsova-Dashkova, who is the sister of Peter III's mistress, but very much an advocate of Catherine II. And Dashkova has left a very a memoir that we can read where she talks about she's one of the people that goes to rouse Catherine in the night in the after midnight sometime on January 28th to bring her to appear before the Ismailovsky regiment of soldiers. So she's quite close to events, even as historians think that she may have exaggerated her own role in the coup, kind of in an attempt of self-aggrandizement. But she is close to event. She, puts herself at risk to help Catherine come to the throne. The coup could have gone a different way, and then you better believe heads were going to roll, metaphorically or literally, of the people that were involved in that. She will go on to be appointed the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And so I want to bring that to your attention because the Russian Empire had a female at the head of the Academy of Sciences long before any other Western European country did. And she was also, Dashkova was made member of the American Philosophical Society. She corresponded with Ben Franklin and actually met him in Europe. I can't remember right now if it was in Paris or Scotland that she had the chance to come face to face with Ben Franklin. They exchanged more letters, but Ben Franklin kind of facilitated her being invited to be a member of the American Philosophical Society. So that's Dashkova goes, become a quite prominent woman in the role of in the reign of Catherine, and the sister of the mistress that Peter III would have preferred to oust Catherine for. So, and here is a picture showing, another portrait of Catherine. And now we're going into her space as ruler, and I wanted to show you this slide. So here, a bit of material culture from her coronation in September 1762. This is the carriage she came in. This is the crown she wore. She's the first person to wear this crown, and this tremendously large ruby is gem was bought in China in 72 by a Russian merchant, is my understanding. I'd like to know a little bit more of that jewel history. I can remember reading this account once of a horrific account of someone trying to smuggle jewels into the Russian Empire. And what they did was actually cut their body, inserted diamonds into their leg, re-sewed it, and as a way of smuggling these materials across borders where they would be inspected and were prohibited from taking them without declaration. And just reading in this account that I read many years ago, and it talks about the person getting so like such a severe infection from, kind of a potentially unsanitary surgery and inserting these things into his body that he was on the brink of death, but managed to recover. And boom, that had worked for smuggling diamonds. All right. At any rate, the history of gem smuggling. Um, And so this is the crown, and then this is the gown that she wore. And I want to point out to you, as I have before, you see the double eagle, the symbols of Russia, um, embroidered into the ground, into the gown itself. Catherine is working hard to show that she is Russia. Okay, so now I want to talk about Catherine as enlightened empress or enlightened absolutism. When we think about Catherine the Great, we think about an empress that's self-fashioned herself as an enlightened ruler. What does that mean in the 18th century? And what did that mean in Russia? In some ways, we can almost couch our entire discussion with this remark that Catherine made to Diderot, one of the French philosophes. I'll talk about him. But she wrote to him and she says, Monsieur Diderot, I have listened with the greatest pleasure to all the inspirations flowing from your brilliant mind, but all your grand philosophies, which I understand very well, would do marvelously in books and very badly in practice. In your plans for reform, you forget the difference between our roles. You work only on paper, which consents to anything. It is smooth and flexible and offers no obstacles either to your imagination or to your pen. Whereas I, poor empress, work on human skin, which is far more prickly and sensitive. There's various translations that circulate, but this captures well the gist that of Catherine. On the one hand, she wants to be enlightened. She wants to be a just ruler where there is fairness and rule of law and mercy and productivity and thriving society and opportunity and abundance. Um, but when the rubber hits the road, she ultimately does not succeed in all of the aspirations she set for herself before she was empress. And so that's kind of going to be a theme, the kind of ideal versus the reality. But I want to talk a little bit more about this 18th century context and what did it mean to Catherine? So the Enlightenment is this sometimes known the Age of Reason, and it's this period. And, we generally will put it from the late 17th century, Montesquieu, but full on in the 18th century. The French Revolution is very much an Enlightenment project. And, two ideas of the right Enlightenment are that humanity has the power to reason, and that through reason, people and societies can arrive at a better place. So in some ways, in the sense of there being a celebration of the human possibility, that's like a Renaissance revisited somewhat. But I think that humans have all these capabilities, but central to the Enlightenment is this idea that humans have reason, and we can use our reason to understand things, to arrive at a better place, to be scientific, to make inventions, to govern and order society in more constructive, better, productive ways. The United States of America is the structure of the government of the United States of America, formulated in the Constitution of the late 18th century, is fundamentally an Enlightenment document. If you read the document, reason is referenced repeatedly, that like people can come together and apply reason, not passions, not vibes, not gut feelings, but the reasoned minds working together through reason can arrive at the best way to manage a society. So, and keep in mind, Catherine rules 1762 to 1796, the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783. These things are happening simultaneously. And so I want to just say a few words about some of the central influences on Catherine, two of the major, well, all of the major Enlightenment figures. So, and here we have Voltaire and Montesquieu, Beccaria, and Diderot. So let me just, maybe I'll start with the in age order, if I may. So Montesquieu, and Montesquieu is famous for, probably most famous for writing his 1748 work, The Spirit of Laws. And in it, he's, he sets out these key works on liberty. And he says, government should be set up so that no man need be afraid of another. And this is sort of the like a kernel of liberal government, the idea that you have limited government. And one of the important things that government does is protect rights. And so actually the other important component of the Enlightenment, if I was going to say, there's I'm not an Enlightenment scholar, and there's streams, libraries, you could fill a library with all the books that have been written about what the Enlightenment was, including there's been a real trend in scholarship to say, the Enlightenment was so wonderful, and then there's been a kind of subsequent historiography, as there always is, that has sort of said, look, certain ways of thinking about the Enlightenment really had a dark underbelly to it, and maybe reified ideas about racial superiority and along that. So there's the Enlightenment is complex, but if I was going to just distill it down and really simplify, I when I think about the Enlightenment, I think of these two elements: the ability of humanity to reason and arrive at a more constructive order of things through reason and knowledge. And I also think of this notion of human rights. And again, any phrase in history gets really debatable. When does human rights begin? Some people would locate it in the 20th century. Some people would locate it much earlier, and some people would locate it in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. But that there are universal human rights bestowed on people, not by government, but just innate, inalienable rights. These are the phrases of the Declaration of Independence. These are Enlightenment ideas that people are entitled to, and that it's the task of government to ensure that those rights are not infringed upon. And thus, this is where this notion, this quintessential idea of liberalism, of a limited government that protects the rights of citizens, begins to emerge. And much of this is written down. The Spirit of Laws, 1748, is a very important text in spelling out some of this. Montesquieu also introduces the notion of the separation of powers, that you would have a judicial branch and an executive branch and a legislative branch, and they will be separate entities, each performing their roles in a government. And the United States Constitution is a very much a manifestation of these ideas that Montesquieu put down on paper. He, according to one historian, Montesquieu is the most quoted authority in 18th century pre-revolutionary America. The only book people reference more is the Bible. The Spirit of Laws, incidentally, also gets put on the Catholic Church's index of prohibited books. But at any rate, Catherine is very inspired by Montesquieu and his writing. She is similarly, she is also she's a big fan of Voltaire. And Voltaire is a big figure in the 18th century. Voltaire is actually a pen name. His name was François-Marie Arouet, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. He lives from 1694 to 1778, and he is very much a champion of reason, a champion of tolerance, of independent thinking. He hated fanaticism of any kind, and he and kind of would rail against these sins, as he would have put it. He may have been, one of the world's first explicitly articulating atheists. But so Voltaire is a really big figure, and he wrote in many different genres. He wrote plays and essays and fiction and poetry and letters and his history books. He wrote a history of the Russian Empire. Oh, yeah, which I actually, yes. He wrote a history of the Russian Empire under Peter the Great, which he sent the text to a Russian courtier who kind of looked it over and made editorial suggestions of what the Russian state would or would like not like to see in it. And so those are interesting, and they're an appendix to this version right here. Um, he also wrote a history of Charles XII, Peter's rival in the Great Northern War against Sweden. He wrote about the age of Louis XIV. He wrote a book about Charlemagne. And one Voltaire expert says that Voltaire was actually wrote very good history, that he was scrupulously concerned with finding out what happened. He carefully sifted and cited his evidence, and he presented a intelligent selection of what was significant in explaining change over time. That's, after all, what we historians do. We try to explain change over time. And he also had a keen sense of drama, which can come in handy if you want people to pay attention to the story. Um, and so that's a little bit about Voltaire. Voltaire corresponded extensively with Catherine, and um, yeah, you can read and learn more. Catherine would have loved to have met him. She invited him to Russia many times. He always declined, and but they corresponded a good amount indeed. Now, one of the French Enlightenment thinkers that did agree to come to Russia was Diderot. And Diderot was an Enlightenment thinker. These are two different portraits of him. This is an earlier one, and this is a picture of him done by Levitsky, a Russian court painting. So what's Diderot's big claim to fame? And that is in the Enlightenment. And it is that he, along with Jean Laurent de Lambert, were the editors of the La Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia, which is such an Enlightenment project, in that it's this idea that we will just bring together all the knowledge of all different kinds of things in these books that people can reference and learn. And so, when I grew up, when I grew up, prior to the days of the internet, if you wanted to know a little bit about something, what would you do? Well, you wouldn't Google it. There was no Google. But one way to go about it was to go to an encyclopedia. And it could be, maybe you just needed to know a little bit about something, and, 500 or 600 word article in the Encyclopedia Britannica or something was enough for you to, satisfy that curiosity in the moment. Or maybe it was just a point of departure to learn more about things. So that, in kind of the basic sense for people, this is what an encyclopedia could do. And then the internet came, and we all learned to just Google things. So, I mean, I do it too at this point, when you just want to know a little bit about something. And in some ways, though, think about when Google first came out, it had, what were its aspirations? Well, it had the slogan, "Don't be evil." And that slogan kind of went away and has fallen out of use, for whatever reasons. But the other aspiration was to organize all of the world's information. And so, in some ways, it's a very Enlightenment type project, like this encyclopedia. We're going to find out, like, what is there to know in the world, and we're going to organize it in these books of these volumes that we produce. And so that was the Encyclopédie. He was in money problems, and Catherine learned of him and his work, and she, in order to help his money problems, she bought his entire personal library of 3,000 volumes and invited him to be the caretaker of it for a salary in Russia, and have a stipend. Well, he went to Russia. He ended up not staying a long time. Catherine continued to be quite generous with him financially. And he went on this trip, and here's the map. The blue line is the trip he took to St. Petersburg from Paris, and the red line is the trip he took back. He spent 5 months with her in St. Petersburg, where supposedly they would meet nearly every day. And Catherine delighted in their meetings, even though he had this habit, it was said, of kind of slapping her on the thigh when he made a point. And Catherine even said at one point she resorted to putting a table between them for their conversations in order to protect her thighs. But but she very much enjoyed her time with him. Now, among one of his later works, I want to, before he passed away, he wrote this in his notes. So I'll read you this paragraph. He wrote, on the instructions of Her Imperial Majesty for the drawing up of laws. Now, Catherine had this imperial instruction. We'll talk a little bit about that, her nakaz. He said this, let me find the place of what I wanted. So Diderot wrote late in his life that Catherine was certainly despotic due to circumstances and training, but was not inherently tyrannical. Thus, if she wished to destroy despotism in Russia, she should abdicate her throne and destroy anyone who tries to revive the monarchy. She should publicly declare that there is no true sovereign other than the nation, and there can be no true legislator other than the people. She should create a new Russian legal code establishing an independent legal framework, and it should start with the text, "We the people, and we the sovereign of this people, swear conjointly these laws by which we are judged equally." And in the Nakaz, so Diderot, Diderot dies in 1784. And so he writes this post Declaration of Independence that he says it should start with the words, "We the people." Now, in her nakaz, her instruction, Catherine had written, and this is a quote that Catherine wrote, "It is for the legislation to follow the spirit of the nation." Um, and Diderot's rebuttal stated that it is for legislation to make the spirit of the nation. So, so anyway, this is something that his commentary on Catherine late in his life. Catherine did not see it in his lifetime. She saw it after the fact and was reportedly, quite offended and hurt by her judgment of him. And I think it is the case that Catherine struggled throughout her reign. She wanted respect of the West. She wanted to be seen as a truly Enlightenment figure. In terms of what she actually carried out, she disappointed many, and this is a sort of tension throughout her reign. And she was also, make no mistake, deeply interested in what people were saying about her in Europe. She had people kind of scouring bookshops and texts, and she was quite on occasion kind of moved to write and respond to criticism of her. So she's very attentive to, how she's seen in the West, what's said about her, and what's said about Russia in the West. I mean, Catherine truly did come to identify with the empire with which she ruled. There's one other Enlightenment figure that I think that I want to put on your radar screen with relation to Catherine, and that's Beccaria, Cesar Benassana di Beccaria. And the three other guys I've told you about are Frenchmen, two of them, Diderot and Voltaire, from Paris. And Beccaria is from northern Italy, what became northern Italy. And he was a scholar. He was a criminologist, a jurist, a philosopher. He thinks about laws and how to punish people. And he wrote a famous treatise in 1764, Crime and Punishments. And among other ideas, one of his central ideas is that there should be no death penalty and there should not be torture. In Up to this period, in the most civilized legal systems, torture is a method to get someone to tell you the truth. I mean, now it may sound ridiculous to us because people have come to understand that if you are inflicting huge pain on someone, most likely they will say whatever they understand is necessary in order to make the pain stop. And so the confessions that are wrought under torture can be notoriously unreliable, that torture isn't a good way to get people to say the truth. Um, and but it was a normal part in France in the 17th century, in Russia. A torture session. I talked to you about Peter's own son, Alexei Petrovich. A torture session was a normal part of the interrogation process. And so Bakari is one of the people to say, no, you shouldn't do that. Um, he disapproved of the death penalty, but certainly if there is going to be a death penalty, it should not be unnecessarily cruel. And truly, in early modern states, often, we didn't just get rid of the person; they were um, executed gruesomely, brutally in public. Maybe their body parts would be dismembered and displayed in various places. And now we look back and say, this is what a weak state does. They don't really have the police power behind them to enforce compliance. And so we need to inflict fear by gruesome public displays of punishment. And then once you kind of get into modernity with a very powerful police states, all that kind of public punishment can be sanitized and is unnecessary. Although Beccaria is writing not from the pragmatic standpoint of a very powerful police state, as from a philosophical standpoint that torture is kind of wrong and unconstructive, as are brutal executions. And Catherine is very much inspired by his writing and his thinking. He so she wants to implement many of these ideas and make Russia a better place. Now, I don't want to, so let's go to some of the things that happen in her rule, like with that, all that kind of lead up about Enlightenment ideas and how they influence her. Here we can only kind of touch on a few things, but some aspects of her reign, and actually, this isn't all about Enlightenment right here, but I want to talk to you about her legal reform. I want to talk to you about the problem of serfdom. I'm going to talk to you about how Catherine kills Cossackdom, which is, the way Ukrainian hetmanates rule Ukraine, which has been in the Russian Empire for almost a century at this point, but really has a degree of autonomy. Catherine is going to end that. I'm going to talk to you about the partitions of Poland. That comes more kind of in our discussion of foreign policy. I'm going to talk to you about the Pugachev rebellion, which kind of leads Catherine to be a much kind of leads Catherine to a conservative shift. Basically, if the story of Catherine's, well, I don't want to be too simplistic, right, about this, but if she is very idealistic before she's empress, the realities of rule change that a little bit, and in a general way. But there's two really specific ideas that make Catherine kind of reel back in some of her Enlightenment aspirations. And one of those things is domestic, and one of those things is international. The domestic episode is the Pugachev Rebellion. This happened 1773 to 1774. And the international thing is the French Revolution, which happens a bit later. We'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture. But so let me talk to you a little bit about, well, let's see. Before I get going, I want to just give you a flavor of Catherine's governing. And so she wrote at one point, she said, on an average day, Catherine was constantly occupied with affairs of state, and she was faced with deciding major and minor issues on a daily basis. Should we engage in war? Should I make this decree? And what should the silverware be for this event? She was engaging regularly with major and minor issues. She would relax by engaging in writing. Catherine loved to write. She was writing constantly, and she read and she corresponded with prominent individuals such as Voltaire. And so Catherine was a true workaholic. And here is how she herself described her working day in one of the letters she wrote in 1774. So when she'd been on the throne for 12 years, and she wrote, "My health does not worry me in the least. I get up at 6 a.m. at the latest and sit until 11 a.m. in my office, where I receive not he who is in favor, but he who has business to discuss with me. I often receive people whose names I hardly even know. Those who enjoy my favor have been trained to leave if they are not there on business. After lunch, if there is nothing scheduled, after lunch, while there is nothing scheduled, while in the evening I meet with whomever wants to come and head off to bed at 10:30 at the very latest." So, as I said, she's a voracious letter writer. But don't think of this as, yes, I just told her she relaxes by writing, but don't think of this as just a hobby. There's no email, there's no telephone, let alone Zoom or texting or anything like that. So Catherine's writing does important diplomatic work. Her friendship with Voltaire, it served the purpose of being basically her PR, her public relations arm to much of Europe, that she did maintain a positive relationship with Voltaire, with the French elite and elite in other Enlightenment circles. Actually, in the late 18th century, Scotland is kind of ground zero of Enlightenment thinking. This is where Adam Smith, the famous economist and philosopher, worked. And Well, there's no definitive inventory of all of Catherine's letters, but one figure is that 11,000 published documents bearing her signature have been compiled, of which approximately 6,000 items can conservatively be classified as letters in a modern sense. So not just notes on a meeting or something like that. Catherine's wrote letters in French, in Russian, and in German. She used French for the vast majority of her foreign correspondence and for some letters for Russians. And she used the Russian language in most, but not all of the letters to Grigory Potemkin, the Russian officer that she would install and make very powerful in governing Crimea once it was annexed in 1783. And that it's much been established that she secretly married Potemkin. But so this is sort of the kind of some of the flavor of the days of this, empress who presided over the period of enlightened absolutism in Russia. So Catherine, she aspired to create a well-regulated state. She very much had studied the philosophers, and she, although I want to share with you just one. On the Spirit of Laws, though, it is said she got a copy of it when she had already arrived in Russia, and so she has this husband she can't really hang out with. She's reading a lot more, and she wrote. So not reading the Spirit of Laws, but he wrote. Montesquieu also wrote his text, Consideration on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline. And Catherine, in her memoir, at one point wrote, When I began to read it, it led me to reflect, but I could not read it straight through because it made me yawn. And declaring that it was a fine book, Catherine, just a teenager at that point, tossed it aside to continue getting dressed, is kind of one remark. So, she was human, but there's been a lot of belittling of Catherine, but I think that the people that would just belittle her as a student of philosophy are a bit off the mark. She maybe wasn't a brilliant philosopher, but she was a serious student of history and philosophy and how to govern. So let's talk about a bit how she wanted to govern. She aspired to create a well-regulated state. And she elaborated her own rules for administration. She kind of, in her mission statement, she wrote, one must complete the civilizing of the nation one has been called upon to govern. One must introduce good order into the state, uphold society, and see that it obeys the laws. One must institute good and effective regulatory power in the state. have a working, she did a lot to try and regularize and make uniform and systematic procedures in the Russian government, which some might just call kind of an ad hoc hot mess leading up to this point, and that which isn't, just Russia, but kind of modernity kind of brings together. One of the components of modernity, perhaps, is to make a kind of regular bureaucratic procedure. This is one of the things the Slavophiles later in history will rail against, impersonal bureaucracy. There's no better punching bag in modernity, but as opposed to kind of the hot mess of Muscovy, maybe it wasn't so bad. At any rate, so reading back to kind of Catherine's rules for administration, she also wrote that one must facilitate the flourishing of the state and render it prosperous. So, I mean, she's presiding over one of the most lavish periods of noble, conspicuous consumption in European history. And there's that. There's no looking away from that. But according to this, she does have this view of having the wider nation prosper. And she said as well, one must render the state feared in and of itself. That one must render the state feared in and of itself and respected by its neighbors. So here's a little bit of a harder edge to her understanding of what it means to rule a big empire. In Catherine's view, every subject must be taught to recognize his obligations to the supreme being, toward himself and toward society, and what one must teach each citizen or subject certain skills without which we'll barely get along in everyday life. So she has kind of a pragmatic vein, and she set about studying her own government, trying to learn about it. She had intentions to reform it. She, from the get-go, planned to be a reformer. She was never going to be in her own mind, she was never going to be a status quo ruler. And she wanted to mold Russia into a rational state. She attended the meetings of the Senate, and the discoveries in these sessions convinced her of the need for more reform. So one of the reforms that Catherine intended to carry out but did not ultimately succeed at was legal reform. In 1649, if you'll recall, in the wake of these awful uprisings in Moscow, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich called together the Zemsky Sobor, and they produced a law code called the Ulozhenie. So the Ulozhenie was sort of, well, an early there had been Ruskaya Pravda, the Russian law from medieval times. So there's a tradition of law. It wasn't like they're the first people to think about law, but the 1649 Ulozhenie was kind of a writing down of the laws of Muscovy. And there hadn't been a major reform since. Peter introduces lots of decrees, but Catherine, it says, we're going to have Russian legal reform. And she studies up for this quite a bit. And she writes this grand instruction. And the grand instruction is her kind of Catherine's kind of think piece, wish list on how law should, what's important in the law and how it should be conducted. And so she writes out her nakaz, her instructions for the law, and her intention is to bring together different groups of Russian imperial society to have a kind of conference and workshop all these mission statement priorities and come up with a new law code for the Russian Empire. And so she authors, and it's pretty much said she very much does author the nakaz. She is drawing significantly on Beccaria, sometimes just kind of lifting whole cloth, and they don't have the same footnote standards in the 18th century as we do now. So some people would say she just plagiarized from him. Well, she was, she thought that his ideas were good ones and wanted to implement them in Russia. And so, and then they have these commission, she organizes this commission, and the first meeting happens in July of 1767, and it's this big state event. She kind of presides over the opening convocation of the commission, when where all these different groups, so you have merchant groups and noble groups and tradespeople groups and Kalmaks and Cossacks and different from Russia at that point had, there's no idea of like all citizens are created equal. There's estates, and people are born into certain states, whether it's a merchant estate or an artisan estate or a townsperson estate, a serf estate, a state serf or a noble serf or a clerical serf or an army family or a Cossacks. There's all these kind of different groups. Or if you're descended from Tatars or Kalmyk groups that are in the Russian Empire, everyone had their estate. So it's a very different way of formulating society. And so, at any rate, different estates are going to come together. They all have, been briefed to read the nakaz prior. And Catherine presides over the convocation, draped in her imperial robes, and she's got her most important courtiers around her. And one of her vice chancellor, Alexander Golitsyn, delivered the official welcome, and he reminded all the representatives from different estates that they had been called to Moscow to work toward, quote, the common good, the felicity of mankind, and the introduction of good manners and humanity, tranquility, security, and felicity to your dear fatherland. Like that's what the point, the ultimate goal of having a law code, a kind of new revised law code. Um, it, to make a long story short, it doesn't play out the way that Catherine wanted it to. If Catherine was thinking in terms of generalizable principles for the common good, it seemed that as people came together, they were just interested in their particular rights, privileges, historic privileges, or their own special interests, and that these people, and in large part less educated than Catherine had had the opportunity to be in her, from her noble origins and place in society, as well as the serious study that she'd been engaging in for decades now, right? And so they're just in a different mind world than Catherine, and she was ultimately pretty disappointed. And the session kind of met in two bits in 1667 and 1668, but they were not able to produce a law code. And so many have thought, well, it was a total failure. And others have pointed out, maybe it didn't accomplish what she had originally hoped for, but it wasn't a total failure. This document, the Nakaz, does spell out her thinking about legal issues. It was translated into English, German, French, and by the way, this circulated freely in Russia, but King Louis XV had it banned. He thought the sentiments expressed there within were too dangerous for the common people to be exposed to. And the French monarchy years are numbered at this point. So, I mean, you can think about that. Um, but of course, the philosophers who were deeply critical of kind of an absolutist monarchy, the fact that Louis XV banned the nakaz raised Catherine's stock with the philosophers. But the nakaz was what you could buy it in a bookstore in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. And one of the, and this is, Catherine's translation, and she wrote, the innocent ought not to be tortured, and in the eyes of the law, every person is innocent whose crime is not yet proved. Not only must the torture never be used to secure a confession of guilt, but it was also impermissible as a punishment. Its usage, she affirms, is contrary to all the dictates of nature and reason. A very Enlightenment phrase, nature and reason. Even mankind itself cries out against it and demands loudly its total abolition. So that's Catherine's thoughts on the nakaz. Um, That's all I'll say about that, that she publishes this grand instruction in 1767 and that she has these legislative commissions that have, come to the center and they meet in 1767, 1768, but it amounts to nothing. To kind of one other issue where the tension between Catherine's kind of wants and what happened differs significantly is on the problem of serfdom. And to make a long story short, Catherine, she wrote explicitly. Um, let's see, I would. Oh, wait one moment. I want to find in here. Okay. Oh yeah, and just to why did the legislative commissions end when they ended? The outbreak of the First Russian-Turkish War kind of brought Catherine to say, wait, I need to put my attention to something else. But it had already been going sort of badly. Excuse me. It had already been going sort of badly. Catherine would sometimes, in secret, sit in and listen to these sessions behind some curtain. So people didn't know she was there, but she would listen to what was happening. And she became really disillusioned by the kind of nature and content of the conversations she was hearing. So that also contributed to her being less enthused with how the project was actually going. And then when the first Russo-Turkish War broke out, she signed a decree adjourning the commission, and that was sort of how that happened. That's what happened with that. I think that at the time she probably still had intentions to get back to it and see if she could pull something off big on this issue of, law code and trials and protocols, et cetera, and how the judicial system would work. But it didn't quite happen. The Okay, the problem of serfdom. So when she was Grand Duchess Catherine, she once wrote down on a piece of paper, "It is against the Christian faith and against justice to make people slaves. People are born free." However, um, this is where she really differed when it came time to rule. When noble estates were swept up and really kind of ransacked by peasant uprisings early in her reign, Catherine quickly issued a manifesto. Yeah, in the wake of Peter's murder, this was a dislocating moment, and rumors spreading. You had some peasant uprisings that started to just, bring a little pitchfork diplomacy and ransacked the states of the noblemen on whose estates they worked. Serfs did this. And Catherine, one of the soonest things she did was issue a decree in which she declared, quote, "We intend to keep the landowners' estates and possessions inviolate and to maintain the peasants in proper submission to them." So, um, on the one hand, this German princess has just participated in a coup. She is really going to need the support of the nobility, which are an important component of the state, to hold on to her throne. So in some ways, it makes no surprise that on day two, after murdering her husband, she would say something like, "And all your serfs are for the serfs, the basis of your wealth, the kind of the labor on whose backs you enjoy a privileged and luxurious, or not always luxurious, but often luxurious, the biggest ones, lifestyle. I'm going to take away that entitlement." That probably would not have been that she probably would not have lasted very long on the throne if she had done that sort of thing. But nonetheless, we see a big disconnect. And she was on the throne for 34 years. And did she ever do anything? Did she ever eliminate serfdom? The answer is no. And in fact, in Ukraine, she expanded serfdom. Remember, I mentioned how she kills Cossackdom by trying to eliminate the hetmanate, which is the Cossack Cossack form of government that pretty much obtains in much of Ukraine, that Russia had annexed after its wars with Poland in the late 17th century. But it's been kind of doing its own thing, and there were historical privileges, etc. And so they're more or less self-governing. And Catherine tries to eliminate that. Of course, she recognizes in a famous letter, and I won't quote it to you right now, but in a famous text, Catherine writes, Ukraine, it's different. It's got different customs, different ways of living, different traditions. It's not the Russian Empire. So what we need to do is eliminate its self-governing institutions in a way that doesn't make people too angry, in a way that doesn't get too much notice. So we will do it slowly, and we will do it rather than kind of taking the bull by the horns and being really in your face about it. We'll try and be more subtle about it, where we'll try and, um, you know, install people that are quite favorable to my way of Peter St. Peterburg's way of seeing things, and they will do our bidding to where people can gradually forget, and we won't make a big deal of it. We will kind of eliminate that Ukrainian particularity slowly, gently. So that was sort of her approach, and trying to kind of install hetmanates that are pretty much doing her bidding first before kind of bringing in the administrative reforms that make the bureaucracy uniform in a way that eliminate kind of the self-governing that had already kind of been chipped away at before they formally take it away. That. So in the process of making those sorts of changes, Catherine takes a whole lot of land and awards people that are loyal and faithful to her. She awards them estates. Now, to be awarded an estate in Imperial Russia is that the land comes with the serfs who work it, the peasants who worked it. So she actually is ends up extending serfdom into Ukraine. It didn't exist there in large part. And when they take Crimea and then that northern part, which at the time was called Novaya Rossiya, New Russia, a term that Putin has tried to resurrect in his imperial grab for Ukraine, Catherine actually takes steps to extend and increase serfdom in the hour. And so if on the one hand in 1764, early in her reign, she does make a decree lightening the load and kind of placing limits on the demands lords could make on about what amounted to 2 million serfs at the time. If that we might put in the plus favor for, Catherine on serfdom. In the minus favor, she understood serfdom to be wrong. She was and she did not eliminate it. She actually extended it to Ukraine. And yeah, one of these questions is it if she had felt secure enough on the throne, might she have acted differently? And on the one hand, you can say, okay, fine. Early in her reign, she's come to power through a coup, isn't really all that entitled to this throne. Of course, she needs to be watching her back, and she better not piss off the mobility, excuse my language. But later in her era, there she's really running the show. Why doesn't she do anything then? And I think this is a fair question to ask. I'd like to understand it better myself. I know one thing that is said is that, because as secure as she was on the throne, there were people that thought Catherine's son Paul should be emperor. And I actually didn't mention this at all, but one of the ideas when people were like, oh, we got to get rid of Peter III, what should we do? One of the ideas was to say, oh, have Paul installed as czar right away, and Catherine, who seems to have a pretty good head on her shoulders, and be way better than Peter, will have Catherine be his regent. But the czardom will pass right to Paul. And this idea ultimately got rejected, maybe because, between Ivan VI and the previous, Elizaveta Petrovna came to power in a coup that went over pretty easily because there were enough people that were like, no, a child can't be the czar of the Russian Empire. So for whatever reason, for her entire long reign, Catherine doesn't eliminate serfdom. And we will wrap up there on Catherine and talk more about her ruling the empire next time. Okay.